Hello guys, and welcome to this episode of our Dissemination Day series, which is episode 7?
8.
8. Knew it was 7 or 8. And we decided today that we were just going to give a bit of a summary really of the last 3 papers that we did. First one by myself, second by Han. And third by yourself too, wasn't it?
So you did
Ashley.
the DeVoe and McGill paper.
We did it together.
We did it together.
Together.
Although I hadn't read it, you'd prepared it.
Yeah.
The DeVoe, I can't remember what year it is. Do you remember off the top of your head?
2014, could be a lie, but roughly somewhere around there.
And then you did the first Beadle Brown
2014.
Yeah. And I did Beadle Brown 2015.
Yeah.
All on practice leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And so we wanted to give a kind of bit of a summary of those papers and what we found. But interestingly, I think something that's come out of, we've had our kind of quarterly team meeting today, and our company secretary came out with something that I thought was really interesting. And he said he's been really enjoying the Dissemination Day series, but he was really interested if we could just perhaps make it a little bit more accessible. A little bit clearer in kind of how people can use it, because he was feeling that perhaps it was a little bit academic, but again, we're all used to reading those kind of papers.
Yeah.
Company secretary isn't, so kind of I think one of the things I was maybe hoping for from this is that again we're kind of linking the findings from those 3 papers, our interpretation of that, and kind of putting it back out there for the audience, maybe as a bit of a lead about what to do about this now.
Yeah. So how do we want to do this? What themes do we want to go?
Well, again, I think maybe there's a couple of kind of what are some of the key points that came out of each of those papers, and I think we don't want to go over all of those because we already have in those. But I mean, essentially, in that first paper that we looked at, just to recap, talked about practice leadership being all about supporting the development and maintenance of good staff support for the people that they support, basically. And there's a whole raft of stuff, observations, etc., etc., etc. So I think it'd be really interesting, across the 3 papers, what is it that we have, what is it that's emerged that's really linked to that, the emergence of, the development of good staff support for the people that they support, if that makes sense.
Okay. What leads to the development of good staff support?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So my first question, I think I asked you this in the first paper, and with in consideration of all 3 papers, my initial question was, who is the practice lead? Who should that be?
And this is one of the things that I loved from your paper in particular, because I think, practice leadership is something that I think those that are researching it and those that are writing about it will say this is really evolving at the minute. And I think one of the things I was delighted, because originally this really came from the manager as the practice leader. And again, thank you to people that have contacted us about the Dissemination Day series, and there was someone that did contact us saying that they thought good managers could manage the paperwork side of it and do that. And I think that's absolutely right, but I think there are so many variables. Some managers are managing care homes of 40, 50 people.
Or multiple care homes.
That
are hours apart from one another.
So I think that there certainly are managers that can do it and that are excellent at it, that are great at it. But again, I think there are perhaps some roles that becomes much more difficult to do that. And it's one of the things that I really liked in the paper that you had reviewed, T, and it was talking about, jumping through notes, but focusing on an individual who has direct line responsibility for leading the practice of staff on a day-to-day basis.
On a day-to-day basis.
Yes. And I love that, because I think that that opens it up much wider than just that manager. And it also goes in line with Roy DeVoe's real concept that he talks a lot about, distributed practice leadership.
But was there not something in Hannah's paper about the relationship between management and what was that?
Yeah, interestingly, and again, I suppose it's pointing at the fact that practice leadership doesn't have to be from the manager, because the finding was that actually the quality of management and the quality of practice leadership had to be high to have an actual real difference on
so you need both
levels of active support. So
it might be the same person doing both,
absolutely.
or it might be different people doing both.
Yeah.
And I think for me, again, I think it's quite encouraging actually because it's not that you can't have both of those skills. I think we've probably all seen and worked with people that do have all of those skills. But actually, sometimes you'll find people that are great managers. They're so detailed, they're process driven, they're great at getting things to happen. But the practice leadership aspect, if you speak to someone like a Roy Devine, he really talks about leadership being the exercise of social influence. You know, and that sometimes people are great at one and not the other. And I think that's the encouraging bit from Hannah's paper. Really, it doesn't have to be the same people, but somebody needs to be making sure that the service is managed in a way where the frequency of supervisions or team meetings or training or whatever it is set. And then let someone exert that social influence.
Like top-down influence. Yes. Someone's in charge from above. And in a sense, it's better because it's not one person being the be-all and end-all in that service, being the only person who's practice leading.
And we've all seen that, haven't we, where someone's, you're the person that's expected to now implement practice leadership in the organisation. And similar to, we've all seen it with positive behaviour support too. Someone's gone away, done some PBS course, whether it's a full-on university course or if it's a 2-3 day course somewhere. And then they're expected to come back into a service and be the PBS person. Yep. I think we've probably all actually been in that position too, and it is terrifying. It's really hard. So I think it's really encouraging. And some of this is, I hope that people that watch these Dissemination Day series, I hope that it's useful, because for people to be able to go back to their line managers perhaps and say, I'm all up for this practice leadership stuff. It's great, but I'm going to need some help. I'm going to need some help securing the resources or releasing our staff for this training or whatever it might be, and knowing that actually you don't have to be excellent at all of these things.
Yeah. And sometimes this could just, well, I doubt it's just my experience, but you can spend a lot of time trying to make a particular person your practice lead when actually the entire time in the service there is already someone who's doing that job and just doesn't have the title for it, doesn't have that aren't being specifically nominated to do it. Yes. And actually, I think, is there something about the L'Oreal effect? You're born with it. Is there something about being born with it?
There are people like that.
Yeah.
The L'Oreal effect.
Yeah, she's born with it.
I usually also say.
No, we're not allowed to do any brands. Yeah, no, we don't want people thinking we're marketing them. But yeah, it's sometimes you'll go into a service and you'll see a support worker and you're like, wow, they're nailing that. That they're so good at it. It's the tacit learning.
Yes.
Which probably brings you on to another point that you want to discuss.
Well, I think, again, that's great, because very often, isn't it? And I think that you go into services, and our old mate Netta, our old colleague Netta, will always talk about, you need to spend as much time polishing up your golden apples as you do getting rid of the rotten apples. And I think it's a really important point. Actually, we see it very often, isn't it? And I also think it shifts the role of practitioners and consultants in services sometimes to really working in partnership with those people that you do when you just go into a service sometimes and spend some time with that service. And really interesting, Poonam's position as a trainee, being in services, because the services are so used to having you around now, that observer reactivity is starting to go. So again, observer reactivity, just the presence of someone observing in your setting changes that setting, and it's very difficult for people to act naturally within that setting. So, we travel the country, and we're in and we're out, and we try and develop relationships as much as possible. But in your position at the minute,
it's
very different. I think you've been finding that, haven't you, that you're really able to see within services when there's just pockets of excellence coming up to the surface, and then you and I work together to figure out how we're going to distribute, how we're going to formalise that in some way and share that across the staff team. So I think we're hopefully really developing a model where we're really able to kind of target and pull that out of the staff teams, and then figure out how we can share that across the services. And interestingly, I think it's going to result in a lot less classroom-based training.
Most definitely. You used the apple analogy there, and it made me think of if you've got 50 apples in a barrel and one of them's rotten, then all the ones that are touching the rotten one become rotten. But actually, if you reverse the analogy, all the apples that are touching the golden apple become golden, and that's
the Midas effect.
Yeah, it's like an analogy for what practice leadership is. It's the golden apple having that effect, that contagious effect for good practice rather than poor practice.
but it's not just going to happen. You know, there needs to be
contact.
Yeah, there needs to be contact, and it needs to be kind of explicitly, or in fact, I haven't seen any research on this, but my guess is you advance that more quickly by having a clear plan. You know, you could just hope they're all going to rub off on each other and everything turns golden, but I think it's very unlikely. You know, so again, I think it's all of this stuff for me is I really like, particularly some of the findings from yours, Han, that did speak about, because I think it was one of Roy's papers first that really spoke about management and leadership and needing kind of both. Your paper demonstrated that and showed that
being so important. Yeah,
that it needs it, and I like that because I think it really, from a strategic alignment perspective, you know, it needs to be known that this is something that needs to be some strategy for. You can't just train someone to be a practice leader, get them out there and hope that it's going to rub off on all those other apples.
And do we say, like, is that the way to go? Is it, you know, this Rose Cottage's practice leader is Jack? Or do you highlight the specific skills and specific talents of particular staff members? I remember Pinham, you told me once about somebody that was particularly good at a personal care routine, and like, were they the practice leader for the personal care routine, or are you looking to have like one person be responsible for all of it?
It's what we've done, isn't it? So it's as an individual at the service, and particularly morning times, you know, personal care routines have been really difficult for this individual, and there's a couple of members of staff that saying, I don't have those problems. So we've gone in, observed those staff as well, just to help us figure out what we were going to do about it, and seeing that actually they weren't having the same problems. So our task then was to figure out why. What is it they're doing differently? So bringing those guys in, developing a task analysis for that particular morning routine, and we're now at the stage where we're going to get those 2-3 people to test that first. Poonam's going to be involved in procedural fidelity check of that, so just making sure those things are happening. But again, not in terms of wanting to review those particular staff members, but going, is this task analysis right? Because actually, if we've got 10 steps and really it's only 5 of those steps are key, let's get rid of those 5. Let's keep stuff as simple as possible for the next wave of people that we want to train in that.
So it's not, so far we've got, it doesn't need to be the service manager. You need to have a good service manager, but it doesn't need to be the service manager who's responsible for practice leadership. And we've also identified that it actually doesn't even need to be a single practice leader, because you might have somebody that feels super confident working with Hayley, but not all that confident working with Jim, and you need to allow for that.
Yes.
So there are golden apples in particular circumstances, but you want as much contact between that golden apple and the apples surrounding it. I'm overextending this analogy now. But you want as much contact between the practice leader and the other members of that support network as possible, in order to increase the likelihood that those good practices will transfer.
Yeah. And I think, you know, in terms of developing the culture of staff teams, I think is that something that, you know, it's to extend that skill set within a staff team. I think is really important, because again, I think, you know, people talk about it all the time, don't you? As a consultancy, we should be kind of trying to work our way out of a job. You know, we always talk about that. And this is one of the ways of doing it. You know, we want to empower staff to feel that they do have the skills within their service to be able to approach some of these things that previously challenged them. And very often, you know, as the work that we all do, we know that a lot of the answers lie within. There might be someone within that staff team that the answers for that particular element of practice, they lie there. So by trying to shape up new behaviours within that staff team and show them a process, this is how we approach this. We pick that particular target behaviour, we're going to operationalise it, we're going to figure out a strategy of how we distribute this across the staff team. My hope is that you know, we will end up getting less referrals of that nature in many respects. And so I think, again, and none of that we've spoken about a manager, none of that we've spoken about anything, but again, I think it also, it gives that, my hope is that it really helps support staff to create that sense of worth and value. You know, how many times we've all said that we hate hearing that phrase, I'm just a support worker. Well, I think here we're really showing that actually those support workers are the ones that are really helping us figure out the strategies here, and they're helping us test them, they're helping us prove or disprove that. It's absolutely invaluable.
We say it all the time, don't we, that those guys, we cannot walk in and fix a situation. We don't know these individuals half the time. It's the people who are, it's the support workers who know them, who have all that information, and really our task is to pull it out of their heads. And
it's not just about leading on specific practice either, it's about leading on a positive culture, leading on those values, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, you can have the best morning routine with somebody, but you know, the values of the way that people are in that service is you know, having a detrimental impact.
I found it quite depressing in my paper that only 5 out of 58 services rated as good to excellent on practice leadership. And I wonder now, following that conversation, if it's because people are trying to define practice leadership as a thing rather than as an approach. Are they looking for do people think I need a practice leader and I haven't gotten around to that yet, rather than seizing like any opportunity to demonstrate good practice leadership in their service? And I wondered if that is linked with the other part that I wrote down that I thought was interesting, because it came up in Hannah's paper too, which is possibly because they have the same author, but that people, so this is a slightly different point, but just to keep us on there, people who have more of an intellectual disability are receiving less active support, which is obviously linked to practice leadership, because good practice leadership results in better active support. Why do we think people with ID are receiving less good active support?
And less engagement as well. In my study, it was also worse active support and actually less engagement from people around them.
That 60% unengaged time, I think, is one of the crucial parts of practice leadership for me, because it's going to be through awesome practice leadership that we start to negate some of that unstructured time. And we all know, how often have we been in to do an assessment and we're like, so some of these behaviours I'm afraid are happening because the person is not engaged, or at least being contributed to by the fact that the person is not engaged. You know, that one of the people that you work with that we were talking about earlier gets bored, and he's like, I'm going, you know, and I worked with a guy who used to call the emergency services because he was looking for something fun to do. Like, you know, this contributes. So how do we get in there? Like, so that there's two parts to that. Why do people with ID receive or intellectual disability or learning disability have less good access support? And I wondered if it's because it's harder to get some of these individuals engaged. You know, is it as simple as that? And the second part is, how can we utilise practice leadership to specifically target that massive dearth of engagement? Because it's not just about challenging behaviour, is it?
I think there's some really interesting points there. I think, you know, again, without going over the papers again, we know there's a really high turnover rate of staff in this industry. And with that, very often goes that tacit knowledge. It's not written down anywhere. You know, you'll see two people in the service that just seem to have this chemistry. They're not following a sport plan, they're not following any guidance, they just have this lovely chemistry together. And I think with, you know, when there's industry average is about 34% at the minute turnover rates, I think, of staff annually on average. And we'll have all seen rates of up to 60, 70%. You know, so if you're replacing 7 out of 10 staff every year, you know, you need to really be on the ball in terms of interaction. And I think sometimes that's what's happening. I think people aren't sure how to go about it. And I think some of the interesting stuff for me in these papers that we'd read was about, you know, there almost needs to be a clear and explicit follow-on from any training that you do. How are you going to bring this to life in your service? And practice leadership seems to be the vehicle. So, you know, if you were to do induction training for staff, perhaps it's better that you focus on, and again, linking in another paper that we've looked at this year, Brian McLean and Ian Gray's intervention sequence outline, you know, train staff in how to maintain, promote a low arousal environment first. Then focus on rapport with the individuals at your services, and then focus on kind of improving predictability within the service. They're all kind of set and event variables, aren't they? You know, perhaps there's something in there about how do we support staff from an induction level practically, because as we've seen in a lot of this research, classroom-based training makes a difference. It does make a bit of a difference. but it washes out quite quickly.
Yeah.
Feedback is so important. Presence is so important. Some of the stuff from your paper, Hannah, was really interesting to see. A lot of people having team meetings, which are more than I thought, which is good. 71% of those. All from the same organisation, this paper, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But content-wise, what were they covering? Because it wasn't...
45% their main focus was around quality of life. So, 55% that wasn't their main focus. So what was that focus on if it wasn't on the quality of life of the people that they're supporting?
And only 16% in terms of activities and active support, was it?
That's around supervision. So within supervision, the discussion focusing around activities and active support was only in 16% of the supervisions.
Right.
So monthly supervisions in 51% of cases.
Yeah. And then the what were the bottom two?
It's around the modelling. So manager observing practice at least monthly. That was happening again. I think a little bit more than we'd probably be expecting. 59%. But actually modelling good practice and giving feedback were in the 40s, 44% and 42%. So like you say, that importance of feedback only occurring in quite a small percentage of cases.
I think this would be the thing, isn't it? I don't think there's any one blueprint for an organisation. I think it needs to be nuanced. But again, I think there'd really be something like the training that we're doing for another organisation that we're just putting together at the minute. We really wanted to have a massive focus on minimising the classroom-based training. Minimise that, get some procedures together, and let's get out there with that staff team working on those, and let's see what works and what doesn't and come back. So I think the implications of some of this are about, when you're thinking about resources, exactly like you said, what roles need to occur within your service or your setting, and being clear about how we're going to support these practices to become part of the culture with staff teams. Like the tomato analogy that I like so much. If the tomatoes aren't growing, you can't blame the plant. We need to focus on the environment. What's the soil like? Is it in the right light? And I think very often, we're sometimes focusing on the wrong things. There's that saying, systems are perfectly designed to get the results that they get. If you're not getting the right results, sometimes you need to look at your system and see what systemic changes we can make.
Crucial. Yeah. We have 2 minutes left. Any final points? So far I've written down as the key points that it doesn't have to be the manager. Don't if you're in a service, don't feel like you need to be looking at the manager to be responsible for practice leadership in your services. Figure out who's good at what, highlight their skills, and then create contact between those awesome skills and the staff who don't have those skills yet. On top of that, you've got to have feedback. So ensure that feedback process is happening. Classroom training is great, but it isn't the be-all and end-all. So if you can't free up staff for classroom training, don't wait around for that to happen. Get the contact happening between the good, task analyze what that particular staff member is good at. Write down those protocols and have them engage in the process with other staff members, especially when you have a high turnover of staff.
And it's about classroom training leading into actions as well, isn't it? Just stopping when you leave at the end of the day. It's what are you taking from that and actually making a difference with.
Absolutely. Those were my points. Did I miss one?
I don't think so.
I think they're good points. Again, I think that for me, one of those key points is both paying attention to the management and leadership aspects of this. Those formalised processes in terms of resource management allocation can enable those people to focus on the social influence within services. And I think it's really important sometimes for people to kind of have confidence with that, to let staff go and do their thing. And actually, sometimes it's not all the stuff that's written down that's important. We can over-engineer things. Like I said, there are studies out there that just show by presence and feedback in services, there are dramatic improvements to performance. Yet very often, any supernumerary time in services is taken up with administrative responsibilities. So again, I think there's things to look at there.
And I also think it's important, because we've talked about this 60% unstructured time, to set reasonable targets. You're not going to go into a service and go from 60% unstructured to 5% unstructured overnight. you're going to aim for 59%, 58%, 57%. And with focusing on particular tasks like you did with the personal care routine, you know, you will get that gradual process where things are improving steadily but at a manageable rate. No?
So practice leadership's awesome.
Go and do it.
Yes. Yeah.
Get involved.
Good synopsis.
See you.
See you guys.